Okay, switching to English now. Next up, the datafication of the welfare state. Lina Dencik with us. And here's what's about. It's about data and algorithmic processes are increasingly an integral part of governing populations and used to categorize, profile, and score individuals, households, and communities with the view to allocate services, target, and identify people, and make decisions about them. In this sense, datafication is part of reshaping state-citizen relations, the nature of statecraft, and redefining state models, particularly in relation to public services and welfare provision. Advancing unevenly and in diverse contexts, this trend is often underpinned by a rationale centered on efficiency, resource saving, and more objective decision-making. At the same time, research has suggested that data analytics advances a society organized around risk management, in which it is assumed that it is possible to predict individual behavior from the aggregation of data points pertaining to group traits, with the aim to both preempt and personalize risk. In addition, many of the tools being deployed originate in a commercial sphere, perpetuating the presence of multinational companies in the public sector, often favoring economic values rather than social, relational, and personal values. These logics can be seen as the continued dismantling of the welfare state, understood in terms of a commitment to universal access, decommodification, and social solidarity. Moreover, the prevalence of data science, as developed and practiced by a few dominant global players, raise questions about the standardization of governance and statecraft. By fleshing out these issues, this talk will reflect on transformations brought about by data processes in the public sector and across social life, and contextualize these in terms of different value systems and visions for how society should be organized. Lina Dencik is Associate Professor at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, UK, and is co-founder of the Data Justice Lab. She has published widely on digital media and the politics of data and is currently principal investigator of the Data Justice Project, funded by an ERC starting grant. Her publications include Media and Global Civil Society, Palgrave 2012, Worker Resistance and Media, Peter Lang 2015, and Digital Citizenship in a Datafied Society, Polity 2018. Please.
Up now? On button. Okay. I will. Yes, I'll talk a little bit about what was mentioned, but hopefully in a slightly more accessible way. What I wanted to start out with doing, though, if that's okay, is tell you a little bit about this Data Justice Lab, which is a relatively, well, it's been around for a couple of years, but it's just to sort of tell you a bit about the kind of research that we're doing, because this project on public services that we've looked at that relates to this question of the welfare state is one of the projects that we are engaging in. But this idea of data justice is a broader kind of conceptual tool, if you like, that is about, I guess, focusing the research agenda in a particular way when it comes to engaging with automation or algorithms or datafication, however you want to talk about it. So I'll just start out just providing a little bit of explanation as to what we mean when we're talking about data justice and what kind of research agenda that invites. And then I'll go on to the specific study that we did of public services in the UK and what that might tell us about what's happening with the welfare state. So first of all, this is who we are in the Data Justice Lab. So we're about sort of 10 or 11 people. Now we are researchers predominantly, we're academics, so we are sort of a combination of more senior academics and then postdocs and PhD students and research assistants working across a number of different projects. And so the research that I'm presenting today is very much a collective effort. That's also important to say, right? And we were publicly launched in March 2017. Now, importantly, we're situated within a School of Journalism, Media and Culture, and that's also the disciplinary sort of framework that shapes our thinking about some of these issues. So that means that we come to this question around data and algorithms as social scientists predominantly. So we're not computer scientists, we're not from sort of a background of technology, although we work with computer scientists for some of our research. But predominantly we're interested in sort of, broadly speaking, social science questions. We have this expanding team of researchers with us. Now, the nature of the projects that we are looking at stretch across different areas. So I have this European Research Council grant, which is kind of playing with this idea of data justice more broadly. I look across areas of law enforcement and policing, areas of borders and migration, and areas of what's happening within workplaces, or what's happening to the nature of workplaces in relation to the use of data-driven systems. And that's to try and sort of, broadly speaking, come to terms with understanding datafication from a social justice perspective. But then we also have these other projects. So the one that I'll be talking about later is specifically this one called Data Scores, investigating uses of citizen scoring in public services. But we also have looked at policy questions and the nature of regulatory approaches. My colleague, Joanna Redden, runs something called the Data Harms Record, which is on our website and open access, etc., where she tries to sort of actually come up with concrete illustrative examples of the types of harms that might be emerging from data-driven systems, and actually using concrete examples from around the world to talk about a kind of typology of different harms. And then my colleague Emiliano Trere has a thing called Big Data from the South, which is a network that tries to expand our perspective a bit, because we have predominantly set up this lab actually to sort of create a European perspective of some of the developments that are happening and some of the issues that are happening. Now, we did that a couple of years ago because at that time, the debate was overwhelmingly being shaped by US developments, and also US perspectives of what the issues are. And so what we wanted to do was actually think about, well, are these issues going to be different in a European context? And also, are the developments going to be different in a European context? But we're trying to sort of move beyond that now as well, and also bring in more questions from the Global South, and actually questions about the relationship between the Global North and the Global South in these kinds of developments, because that's actually a really important area as well, where people talk increasingly about new forms of colonialism emerging with the development of these types of systems and the kind of extraction that happens as these big tech companies move into various parts of the world. And then we also have, now I'll mention this at the very end of the presentation, a new project that is trying to think about ways in which we might intervene in some of the developments that are happening in public sector, but also elsewhere. So what are the sort of opportunities for citizens or communities to actually have voice in terms of how technologies are developing and being used in various aspects of our lives. So I'll just touch on that at the end. Now, in terms of what we do, I just want to sort of highlight that we are obviously predominantly academics, but I think one of the things so we do host sort of conferences. We had one last year. We are hosting another one. The call for papers is open, and we welcome contributions or submissions for that. But it's predominantly to combine actually scholars with activists and with practitioners around these issues. So we also do so some of this will be scholarly work that's presented, but also actually workshops with various different stakeholders. And we try and do a lot of that within the Data Just Labs, actually bring together different stakeholders to engage with issues. So say that's people from the public sector together with civil society groups, together with academics, for example, right? So these are the kinds of things that we try and do. We also try and engage with policymakers if they want to listen to us. And because we sit in a journalism school, what we're trying to do, so we're sort of on the more academic side, we don't engage in the journalism training that happens, but Cardiff University has a large journalism school where they train a lot of journalists. And one of the issues that we have found is that the reporting of these developments is quite lacking. We don't really have much public debate or information about what is actually happening, for example, in terms of the use of data analytics in public sector. And in part, that's because it's incredibly difficult to investigate these kinds of issues, right? And so what we're trying to do is actually say, well, can some of the methods and skills that we're using as social scientists to investigate this be transferred also to journalism education, to try and think about how we can improve the reporting about what is happening in terms of data-driven decision-making or algorithmic decision-making. So that's another area that we're trying to do. Now, in terms of where we're coming from to this, I should say that I initially came to this topic actually having looked at questions of digital surveillance, and particularly the Snowden leaks, which first were published in 2013, that implicated the UK quite a lot in terms of what Snowden revealed was going on in terms of digital surveillance programs. But what was important actually out of that research, and why we sort of decided to set up the Data Justice Lab, was that it revealed at one level the extent to which what we're dealing with is a particular political economy of our digital media technologies that have implications for how we're being governed as citizens. Because the kinds of sort of the digital surveillance programs that Snowden revealed were taking place relied on this accumulation logic of data collection and analysis that drives our tech industry, that drives our digital media industry. It's because of that business model, because of that political economy, that those types of surveillance programs were enabled. So that is just to highlight the kind of very close relationship between corporate interests and state interests when it comes to data collection and analysis. And the Snowden leaks really made that very clear. The Snowden leaks also made clear really the extent of data collection that we have now and the normalization, if you like, of surveillance infrastructures in lots of different parts of our lives, because the kinds of technologies that were revealed to be underpinning surveillance programs are what we might think of as sort of everyday technologies, ordinary people's use of mobile phones, search histories, social media activity, things like that. So it's also to show that actually this phenomena of being seen through data, if you like, has become incredibly widespread. Now, of course, the Snowden leaks concern themselves predominantly with intelligence agencies and security services. But what we're seeing, obviously, and what I'll get onto, is that this idea, or this logic of collecting data and analyzing data and making decisions about people off the back of that is something we're seeing now happening across lots of different parts of governance, but also where we might participate in society. So these kinds of stories have emerged in the last few years that really illustrate the extent to which, our ability to cross borders, our ability to get health service or welfare provision, or even, if we get hired for a job, or even if we go to prison or not. All of these areas are now being influenced by this onus on data collection and making predictions and making decisions about people off the back of that. So we're moving towards what we're sort of describing as kind of a datafied society, where this idea is becoming a way of life, or increasingly underpinning at least developments that are happening in lots of different spaces. And so these are the types of issues or developments that we are sort of interested in within the Data Justice Lab, but coming at it, not looking at it just in terms of the nature of the data system itself, but actually trying to think about this in context, historical context, but also broader social and political context. Why is it that these developments are happening? What's driving that kind of logic? So pushing back against this idea that this is just an inevitable development, right? But actually looking at what are the factors that influence the decision to start thinking about society and people in this way, and what are the social and political consequences of that? And that's something that I think, we see happening, because the idea of thinking about data justice is actually also about sort of reframing, I guess, a bit what's at stake. Because what we had sort of in the immediate aftermath of the Snowden leaks was a sort of framing that said, well, what's at stake is that what lots of data collection can give us is more efficient services, greater state security. This is what, why we need surveillance, supposedly, right? Or why we need data collection. But what's at stake is our individual privacy and the protection of personal data. So it's the invasiveness of these infrastructures that's really the major concern. That's kind of how it was presented to us. I think, certainly we did analysis of media coverage in the UK, and often it was presented as a kind of trade-off, right? This is what the price you pay is: privacy for security and efficiency. But I think this is changing now. I think we're recognizing that this is really too limited a way of understanding what's at stake with these technologies. And we've had a host of publications in the last few years, both more popular kind of ones, but also scholarly work, that have kind of highlighted other types of issues that we need to think about, maybe broader issues, if you like, that highlight that actually we need to think about this in terms of social sorting or in terms of forms of discrimination, that actually when we start relying on data collection and analysis about people to make decisions about them, there's a danger that you are relying on what is described as sort of skewed data sets. So historically biased practices mean that data sets with, for example, might overrepresent certain populations or underrepresent certain populations or highlight certain factors that are particularly relevant for some groups but not for others. That mean that these get perpetuated when you start relying on this data in order to make predictions about people and what people might do in the future. But also the nature of the algorithms might be discriminatory in the sense that what gets weighted, so what comes to count, can have discriminatory outcomes. Virginia Eubanks' book on automating inequality highlights the extent to which these systems are contingent or dependent on forms of social and economic inequality, meaning that we're not all equally positioned in this datafied society. We don't get monitored for the same reasons. We don't get monitored the same amount. We're also not all the same equally positioned in terms of how we might challenge decisions about us that are made off the back of these kinds of technological developments. So actually we need to root these developments in questions of social and economic inequality as well, right? But we also have issues around what happens to the democratic process when we start turning to these kinds of technologies, because overwhelmingly these technologies are being developed by private companies and the algorithms are proprietary, which means that we're not able to scrutinize or audit them in any way. So this idea of a black box society, as Frank Pasquale describes it, is another key issue that emerges with the turn to these, or in terms of what's at stake when we turn to these kinds of technologies. And also that, what role do we then want these private companies to have in our society, right? And then especially as these companies come to take on what we might think of as kind of governance functions. So Frank Pasquale talks about a shift from territorial sovereignty to functional sovereignty, where in fact these companies become almost like a sovereign in the sense that they get to influence decisions about us as citizens, so how we're governed as well. So what is the appropriate kind of context for that sort of development? But also sort of, questions around how we come to be recognized in society is increasingly algorithmically processed. And what does that mean in terms of what ownership we have over our own identities and our own understanding of how to be recognized, right? This is another key issue that's at stake then when we start relying on these technologies in more and more aspects of our social life. So this is the logic, I guess, about the reframing this towards a question of social justice, which is really what the notion of data justice is intended to do, to shift it away from this idea that this is about, say, individual rights like privacy, and actually saying this is about social justice and what kind of society we want to live in that incorporates all of these broader issues, right? So we have this lovely animation to illustrate this, the need to integrate data, questions of data, into broader social justice agendas. And I haven't actually mentioned here also the environmental implications of this, which is another key issue, right? So actually when we start, using this or seeing people through data, all of these issues are implicated. Now that's a bit about sort of data justice. I just wanted to sort of have this frame because this kind of approach informs how we then also carry out research and the kinds of questions we're looking for and are trying to engage with when we're carrying out our projects. And the project that I wanted to talk about sort of happened in combination with a visit from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights to the United Kingdom, who wanted to actually look at, initially, it was about investigating the impact of an austerity agenda, so cuts to public services and cuts in the public sector, and what this means for human rights, the human rights implications of that. But actually, he became also very interested in how the role of digital technologies in terms of what this means for human rights, particularly for those living in poverty. And so what they actually concluded in the report that they carried out, on the investigation that they carried out, was this, just to take one quote, "We're witnessing the gradual disappearance of the post-war British welfare state behind a web page and an algorithm. In its place, a digital welfare state is emerging." Now, this conclusion was drawn based on lots of different issues that aren't just to do with the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, that are to do with presence of digital divide, for example. That means that now, in order to access services, there are entire parts of the United Kingdom that are excluded from being able to do so because they actually don't have stable broadband access, for example, right? So there are lots of different issues here. There's also a lot of this concern, a particular initiative in the United Kingdom called Universal Credit, which was the first digital by default policy, which meant that the only way that you could claim benefits, you had to navigate this very difficult or problematically designed web page in order to get so there were those issues were there as well. That's not what I'll be talking about. So all of those in combination with the stuff that I'm talking about, which is about this idea of using data collection in order to make decisions about people or engaging with people, all together sort of led to this idea that actually the kinds of values that inform post-war British, the idea of a post-war British welfare state, to do with universal access, to do with the idea of social solidarity that were kind of celebrated in those years around the welfare state, were being undermined by these technologies. So what Philip Alston has described as the kind of politicization through technology, right, via technology, that actually this is about dismantling the welfare state behind an algorithm or web page, right? Now, the phenomenon, though, that I wanted to focus on, that we focused on in the project, is predominantly this idea of scoring citizens, which we kind of use in a way as a sort of metaphor, if you like, but actually also in some instances it was actually scoring, concretely scoring citizens that we are talking about. But the idea of scoring, or citizen scoring as we describe it as, is this idea of categorizing, sorting, assessing, predicting things about individuals, households, and populations, right, based on data. And of course, this is something that we know from the private sector and from the insurance industry in particular, and from this idea of a credit score, where you try and predict the credit worthiness of somebody. So that's what will inform your ability to get a mortgage, for example. And increasingly in the private sector, that is being informed by collecting and collating lots of different data from various different sources, including data that you might not think should be a part of informing that, like health data, for example. I mean, there's some controversies around what kind of data gets included in making that type or creating that type of score. But it's something that we're seeing in those sectors. And what we were interested in this project is that this logic of scoring is actually migrating into public sector and into governance more broadly, and into sort of defining who we are as citizens. So we are seeing this being used in public services across sort of criminal justice, social benefits in the workplace, child welfare, migration. And of course, the stuff that gets talked about the most in this regard is what's happening in China, with this idea of creating a social credit score, which is supposed to integrate lots of different data in order to predict or say something about the worthiness of a citizen, right, in some way. So also including, you know, how polite they are and various things like this. And that will determine access to lots of different services, or your ability to move around in your life as you want to, or participate in society as you want to. We kind of wanted to push back on this idea, which a lot of the reporting on that has a slightly undertone of xenophobia, you know, that this is what's happening over there in authoritarian China, and something that could never possibly happen in where we are, right, in Europe, etc. And we sort of wanted to say, well, hang on a minute, actually, you know, in the UK, we're seeing developments that may not be as integrated or described in the same way as the social credit score in China, but the same logic, the idea that you can actually make predictions about people that determine their ability to participate in society, is not so alien, actually. It's happening also here, right? So that's kind of what we also wanted to think about. So how do you go about doing that? Well, we had to actually combine lots of different ways of doing that, because as I said, it's actually really hard to investigate these types of developments, because there isn't any sort of public list over all the algorithms that are being used in government, right, at local and central level, although that has actually been recommended to the British government. And I know in New Zealand, they have tried to do that. They've tried to create a public report of what they're using. Maybe that's something that could be pushed for in lots of different countries, that they need to actually create some kind of public account of what types of systems are being used, etc. But it's actually been dependent on researchers and journalists to sort of find this out, right? So we had to sort of figure out a way to do that. So what we started out with doing was to use a similar tool to the one that was used in the United States called algorithm tips. And essentially that is a tool that scrapes based on a lot of different types of keywords that relate to data analytics, predictive analytics, algorithms, etc., that scrape all government websites and then creates a sort of database of that. And so we actually adapted that to the UK and changed the keywords a bit to sort of adhere more to what we knew were the kinds of words that were used in the UK to describe these kinds of technologies. And then we scraped all gov.uk websites for anything with a mention of those types of keywords. Of course, that's not going to give you that much, right? It'll give you some insight, but these are unverified documents. Not all of them are going to be relevant to what we were looking for, but we've created a database, at least, that could give us a starting point with some insights. And actually, that's available there for anybody who wants to look at that and play around with that on this website. But this was one thing that we did, but this wasn't really enough. So what we actually complemented that with was freedom of information requests. And what we did was then submit 423 freedom of information requests to all local authorities and councils in the UK, asking them about their uses of data analytics, and left it relatively general, right? So that they could tell us what kinds of systems they were using and what they were using it for, but particularly for the provision of public services, which is what we were interested in. And then we complemented that with, we then decided to also focus on specific case studies because importantly for us, we wanted to sort of find out the rationale behind this and also how are these systems being used in practice, right? Because it's all very well to say that these systems are being used, but how are they what are they being used for, and how are they being integrated into existing professional practices, right? So we then did some case studies as well with about 6 different case studies of cases where we knew that a certain system had been implemented, and then we did interviews with the people working within the council or the local authority. And then importantly, we also wanted to get stakeholder perspectives. So we also interviewed civil society organizations that work with people who, for example, who are, we might think of as sort of public service stakeholders. So people engaged in welfare rights, people working, disability activists, but also community and civil rights, digital rights activists as well. So a cross-section of civil society to get a sense of their views on this. We also spoke to someone from the British Association for Social Workers to get a perspective of what frontline staff were thinking about these issues. And maybe you spoke about that, but I didn't understand any of it. But yeah, so maybe this links to some of the things that you said. And then we also carried out some workshops with different people then that we had interviews and others, and also with journalists about how they might go on and report on some of this. So this is all the different things we had to do in order to find this out. So just to go through a little bit, the kinds of things that we found. So from our freedom of information requests, we were able to sort of filter through. So we manually filtered through our freedom of information requests to see how many mentions there were of the use, particularly of predictive analytics, which is what we were particularly interested in. So not just, if you like, not just the collection or allocation of data, but also the use of data to take action on something, right? So to actually predict something, either about populations or individuals. And we found 53 councils when we went through that. That's not going to be comprehensive, by the way, and I'll tell you because I'll go on to sort of talk a bit about some of the problems with using freedom of information requests in this context, because councils themselves don't know whether they're using these systems or not. So there's a lot of issues here. But then we also were able to combine that. So we only focused on councils and local authorities for freedom of information requests, but the civil rights organization Liberty did a similar exercise to police forces and submitted 90 freedom of information requests to police forces and identified off that 14 police forces using some form of predictive analytics. Now, what we found in doing this as well, we asked them to mention who they were supplying these systems. And we found that actually there are a few companies that are supplying a lot of these systems across different councils. So we're seeing the emergence of sort of public-private partnerships around a few entities that are kind of dominating the space within this. And in this case, these are Capita, Sanctua, Call Credit, and then interestingly, Experian, which is a consumer rating agency that's used for things like credit scoring, for example. A lot of their data, so they use consumer data, is being bought by councils because they perceive that as being better quality data, right? And so there's some interesting questions around how that data gets used, which is not really clear, but also how consumer data, so our consumer habits, now has an impact on our citizenship, if you like, right? So there's a kind of combination of citizen data and consumer data happening. Predominantly, though, what councils and local authorities were looking to do is to create what they described as data lakes or data warehouses, which is essentially integrating data sets from different parts of the council and maybe also outside data into a comprehensive database to get a sort of integrated view of individuals and households. So that's mostly what councils were looking to do. But then some of these, so these 53 councils, for example, also use these databases in order to kind of put algorithms on top of that to make predictions about people or neighborhoods or or households, right? So these are sort of an added thing that happen as well. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this idea of citizen scoring, really, is that aspect. And the type of areas where we saw it predominantly were in things like assessing the risk of benefit fraud. So the likelihood that somebody will conduct or is conducting benefit fraud. We saw it in the area of child welfare. So here it's the risk of somebody being exploited or neglected or abused, right? So questions within families. And we saw it in policing, where that's by far the area that's received the most news coverage, I think, as well. But there's this idea of either neighborhood mapping, so predicting what neighborhoods are going to be prone to crime, or who is likely to be a criminal, right? So these are the types of areas where we see this. And when we're talking about citizen scoring, the kind of thing where scores are created are, for example, so in the case of benefit fraud, a lot of that is to do with matching, so identity verification. So is it the same person across different records? What's the likelihood? So it's a kind of matching score. What's the likelihood that someone is the same person? And that's the way to identify whether somebody is living where they shouldn't be living, or various things like this. The other area is things like, which is what I'll talk about predominantly, is things like risk assessment and ranking. So this idea of actually giving a risk score to somebody. So the risk of being a criminal, the risk of being abused, etc., right? Or ranking also from high to low in terms of risk. And just two concrete examples. So one is from Bristol. Have I already spoken for 37 minutes? That can't be right. Sorry? 30, sorry? Okay, yeah, sorry. 30 minutes. But anyway, this is from Bristol, this first one, where they do for child welfare. And actually, what's interesting about the Bristol case is that this is developed in-house. So this isn't one that's contracted from elsewhere, but it's very similar in logic to the ones that are contracted by Sanctura, etc. But what they do is they combine sort of 35 different social issue data sets to do with things like mental health, to do with domestic abuse records, to do with criminal records, etc., and integrate that in, and then give all young people and children in Bristol a risk score based on how their characteristics and behaviors match previous victims of what they describe as child exploitation, and that can be various different things, right? And that is then, that will then be a thing that's attached to all children and young people in Bristol. So that's one example of this idea of citizen scoring, right? And the other one is in policing. So this is Avon and Somerset Police, where they also do a risk assessment and rank high risk to low risk offenders. So again, lots of different data that is used to sort of also for all offenders, all people, all victims and offenders of crime within Avon and Somerset, which is actually the county that Bristol is in. That they attribute a risk score for them, right? So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about citizen scoring. Now, in terms of the sort of context for this, so this I think is perhaps the more interesting stuff as well in terms of why are these things happening? You know, why are they turning to these kinds of tools? Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that there isn't one standard way of understanding what data should or can be used for across the different local authorities and councils. So when we looked at our Freedom of Information request responses, for example, what we're seeing is a very varied landscape, right? Some councils think it's appropriate to do this kind of predictive analytics, others really don't think so, right? Some councils think it's very important to make sure that there's consent and some form of informed consent. Others don't think that this is actually, you know, so important, or that would risk gaming the system, right, if you engage with citizens in this way. So we have a kind of heterogeneity of data practices. This isn't just one way, and that's in part based on the fact that there isn't a clear sense of what the regulation should be around this or what it is. So a lot of these areas are exempt from the General Data Protection Regulation Act, for example, because it's trumped by a duty of care. And so what these councils and authorities are having to negotiate is this trade-off between sort of what they see as a trade-off between privacy and then their responsibility to care. That's what they see as being the trade-off that they have to negotiate. And they interpret this in different ways. But there's also an interpretive vacuum in the sense that not all of them see what this data-driven decision-making, that there isn't a shared understanding of what this means or what this actually entails, right? So we found that some councils said, no, we don't do any of this. You know, we don't do any of this. And then actually, they contract with Zentura, for example. So, you know, there are some questions here about how they're understanding their own practices. But I think also what's important to know is a lot of them said when we asked the managers, for example, why are they using these technologies, a lot of it is a response to an austerity context. So a cut in public services means that there is a view that they need to be more efficient with their resources and resource allocation, and this is a way to say that that's what they are being. They're being more efficient with their resource allocation. So it's driven by an austerity context. And Dan McQuillan has actually a nice phrase. He sort of sees the underpinning logics of these technologies as being, you know, a logic that's driven by data-rich and resource-poor societies, right? So this is kind of, these technologies emerge in a context where there's lots of data available and a cut in resources, right? And then you start turning to these. But I think it's also important to keep that austerity context in mind, because it means that these kinds of technologies are being implemented in a context of service reduction. And so it's all very well to say that you're going to be capturing more risk, or you're going to be able to identify need in different ways, but actually it's being done in a context where there aren't any resources to necessarily act on that. So that's, you know, going to create some level of frustration, but also it begs to question the extent to which these technologies become overwhelmingly punitive in that kind of scenario, right? So I think that austerity context is really important to understand sort of political meaning of these kinds of developments. And then the sort of driver for this for these technologies, or using these technologies, is predominantly to get what was described as a kind of golden view of individuals and households, which is about having more information, more granular information about citizens. That's what they're striving to do with this. And the kind of challenges that we found when we spoke to public sector workers were predominantly, so the cultural, in the sense that people were, say, within a council sort of not technically savvy. That was kind of the kind of things that they saw as a challenge, so that frontline workers might be skeptical towards using these technologies because they don't have the confidence in technology, which is also interesting because we might say that people are skeptical about these technologies for other reasons, because they think that they're changing their practices in a way that isn't helpful. But this was often dismissed as being a kind of conservatism or a sort of lack of skill, right? Like that this was the challenge that needed to be overcome, which meant that this can be overcome by more training, you know, more literacy, those kinds of developments, right, was seen as a way to do that. The other challenge is to do with the sort of accuracy levels of these technologies, which are actually startlingly low, right? So, but that's in part to do with data quality issues. So councils hold generally quite poor quality data, and very sort of different kind of data where people have given wrong information to them, or, you know, they haven't collected data. There hasn't been a standard data collection practice, which now means that it's difficult for them to integrate this data and use it in a particularly insightful way. That's at least what they were seeing as being an issue. And what was interesting also is that we asked them sort of what kind of consultation or impact assessment has been carried out when you've decided to use these kinds of systems. And very little, actually. I mean, some privacy impact assessment, they have to do that, also because of the GDPR, some data protection impact assessment. But any sort of assessment of how this might change professional practices, how this might impact on certain communities in different ways, none of those things had been carried out. And in part, that's because, it's not because they don't necessarily want to do that, but they don't have the resources to do it. And also, it's not clear how such an impact assessment would actually be carried out. So this is actually another thing that we're interested in thinking about. What would an impact assessment for this actually mean? What kind of assessment do we need for it? Now, what's interesting, though, is that when we speak to civil society, this kind of lack of impact assessment, or the understanding of challenges as being mainly cultural and technical, and the issues raised by public sector workers kind of become concerning if we start looking at the types of challenges or concerns that were expressed by stakeholders from civil society, who raised very much the issue that this is also a problem with the concerns that I had about this was the sheer extent of data collection and sharing. So, who gets to access this data about different people, sharing between different agencies, for example, between, say, police and social services, what kind of, this is a sort of privacy concern, I guess. But also this issue around how this data will be discriminatory in some ways. So this notion that these data sets are going to be skewed and biased towards against certain communities, certain groups are going to be discriminated against. But I think interestingly, beyond this question of the nature of data and how bias might be entrenched, the broader concern that was brought up often was actually that this leads to a form of stigmatization and stereotyping, because if you start making predictions about people off the back of how people like them tend to behave, you're effectively stereotyping, right? You're stigmatizing groups of people. And that was a concern that came up a lot when we spoke to members of civil society who work with communities, who work with service users. And that's something I think doesn't actually get talked about as much as this issue of bias and discrimination. I think perhaps that's something we need to talk about more. So one person described it as, what right do we have to label somebody as a risk? For example, some people say that's a form of stigmatization, to label someone as a risk, So what right do we have to do that? Another concern that they brought up was this idea of lack of agency. So that's both amongst professionals themselves, so frontline workers. What ability do they have to challenge the use of these systems, or to challenge what decision the model says, right? So what happens if they don't act on a high risk score, for example, etc. And that's especially important because, these systems are quite reductive, right? And so the type of knowledge that a frontline worker might have that informs professional judgment might be very different to what a model says. And the response to this, I should say, amongst public sector workers was often that, well, we would always privilege professional judgment over what a machine says, right? And this often was really stressed a lot, but can that happen in practice, right? This, I think, was a question that was expressed as a concern amongst stakeholders. And then, of course, also, what ability do people where a decision is made about them, what ability do they have to challenge the score, to know about their score? Most of them don't know about what risk score they've been attributed and how that might come to impact them, right? So what ability do we have to act on any of this? And then they raised this issue, which I think Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur, also argued, that actually they didn't see this particularly as being a question about the technology, but actually this is about advancing a certain policy agenda using technology to do so, right? So a lot of them said it doesn't matter what the technology is, because really it's about trying to shrink the public sector or reduce services, right? So really that's what's being advanced with this. That's how they saw it, particularly in this, I think, austerity context. And I think we can sort of engage with that a little bit, because what we're sort of thinking about is that, does the turn to these kinds of systems actually advance a different way of thinking about state-citizen relations? And here we're thinking about some concerns that have been brought up in other contexts as well, where actually, what does expertise mean when we start integrating or using these kinds of systems, right? Because there is an argument that actually professional judgment, or the expertise that we might associate with a professional, is now being transferred to these calculative devices. So these risk assessors, these algorithms become the new experts, if you like. that are being developed in the private space, and we don't know what type of expertise informs the development of these or the design of these algorithms, right? So where does expertise lie in this new kind of datafied society, if you like? And then also that when we start thinking about, so these systems, particularly because they need to sort of scale and they're optimized to capture risk. Well, how does that position citizens? So rather than looking at citizens as being participants or being co-creators, if you like, of society, it predominantly positions citizens as potential risks, right? And so the idea of what public sector is about is to assess the risk of citizens, right? So this is a fundamentally different way of understanding state-citizen relations. That's certainly what was expressed when people talked about the creation of a welfare state, right? And this issue around how do social problems come to be defined? Because importantly, what these systems are designed to do is to attribute risk factors to individual behavior and characteristics. And that means that responses are going to be targeted at individuals, right? And households. Now, this is again a question of, well, what about what we might think of as social issues, like, for example, inequality or rise in homelessness or racism or sexism? These kinds of questions, how do they then come to inform social policy responses? And so the argument is the extent to which this actually individualizes social policy responses, in that the response is entirely focused on individual households and families rather than these broader social issues, social structures, right? And that links also to the last issue, which is something, someone like Mark Andreevich, who's a scholar in Australia, has argued that actually this logic of preemption, this logic of trying to kind of preempt people's behaviors and activities in the future, closes down any debate on underlying causes of why certain developments happen, for example, like an increase in crime, and therefore shifts away any kind of discussion of what might be preventative mechanisms of, say, minimizing crime, and then instead moves towards this idea that we have to constantly preempt crime, right? So it sort of shifts the focus away from prevention towards preemption. And then I'll just very quickly on the final point, some of the stuff that we're talking about, because I think what we're having to do is to think about, well, what these developments are happening without any real public debate, without real proper democratic sort of oversight. But we're seeing, I think, some avenues where this is happening, and this is our project at the moment, where we're trying to think about, well, what are areas for intervention where we could increase democratic discussion and citizen oversight, if you like. And there we're looking within sort of the institution itself, within councils, within local authorities, within government. What are the possibilities to carry out impact assessments, to consult with citizens, to engage with professionals in a meaningful way that would allow for their concerns to be heard, to engage with the public better? With civil society, we're looking at the different strategies that are being used to try and intervene in this space. So a lot of that at the moment, unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of it is responsive. So, for example, strategic litigation or subject access requests to find out how data is being used is often a response to a harm that's already happened. So maybe, we're trying to think what are ways in which we can also have more sort of proactive ways of engaging with this from a civil society perspective. But we're seeing also the rise now, actually, in the UK, a lot of things like citizen juries or citizen assemblies or citizen audits, where actually people are trying to sort of consult with citizens more to see what is appropriate to do with data, from a public sector point of view. What should be the role of data collection analysis in the provision of public services? Now, the extent to which these two things engage with each other is the question, right? So it's all very well that we have these citizen assemblies and citizen juries, but it's not clear at all that they can actually inform how practices are carried out or developments are carried out within government. And then we're also interested in these kind of what we might think of as radical alternatives that push for an entirely new vision of how we should deal with data infrastructures. For example, a completely new idea of say, publicly owned data infrastructures or data commons or data trusts, these kinds of ideas that are emerging, I think, more and more, and where communities have direct oversight over what happens with data. So we're also wanting to think about what are the possibilities for that and what's happening around that. But that's all, I guess, future work that we're hoping to come out with. But I think that's the direction we're wanting to take this, so that we can also provide some, actual feedback around what might be things to do. I'm sorry I went on for so long. Thank you so much. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Questions, comments? Anyone? Someone?
You were saying before that China seems so far away, but not really in our case. Are you familiar with facial recognition cameras in Serbia, or or common police forces, Serbo Chinese and Chinese Croatian forces, and implementation of Chinese 5G in Slovenia? So do you care about 5G in UK?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know much about it, and I only heard about what was happening in Serbia last night. So I can't say that I know much about it. I know that it's it's definitely a discussion point in the UK because it's also going to be provided by Huawei. So I think it's going to be an increasing issue. I think it's always curious to me why, in the sense that, I mean, does it matter more than if Google owned everything? I mean, there's always a question around these kinds of things, right? Where it's interesting who we present as the boogeyman, this is the one to fear. But I think all of these questions, I think it's interesting what's happening now, and I speak now from, I guess, someone who lives in the UK, but I think it's happening in the United States as well, is an onus on ownership questions. So the idea of sort of public ownership of things, so to try and take away from these private actors, because at the end of the day, it's a Chinese company, right? So that sort of to try and push back on the dominance of these in terms of owning all our infrastructure and moving towards some idea that this should be treated as public utility questions or some kind of common good at least, right? So I think it will push the debate more and more in that direction, I think, and we're seeing that emerging already. Yeah. And the sovereignty question, I mean, that's another, Europeans are really big on that, right? I mean, so there's another thing that's also happening where they're talking about we need to ensure technological sovereignty and to push back on predominantly US domination, but also China, yeah.
Thank you for the excellent talk, and you've made a great mapping of how these systems, automated systems, are used in the UK. What about other parts of Europe? You have the ERC project, so I was wondering, what about Central and Eastern Europe? You've done some mapping, and of course, how to respond. The last slide that you had, the very interesting one, how to respond to this, right? So there's a GDPR, data protection law. What about other fields of law? So what should we do? I'm a lawyer, so that's why I'm asking it.
No, that's, I mean, great question. So I don't know a huge amount about what's happening elsewhere, but I know that Algorithm Watch, which is a German organization, tried to produce a European map of automated decision making. And I think there were certainly cases there from Poland and elsewhere, I think particularly around employment, so assessing unemployed people and risk profiling them. But also I think there are instances of things happening elsewhere. I think the UK and the Netherlands are doing a lot with this stuff, perhaps, and maybe it's less so elsewhere. But yeah, I don't know exactly the details of those developments. But in terms of what can be done, so GDPR is only ever going to be, I think, can address some of these issues. But actually, I don't think that that's necessarily where, the main entry points are going to happen. I think what we're seeing is actually this is a way of assessing broader questions of how democratic decision-making takes place, right? So how do we make decisions about people, and how does governance get carried out? And I think these developments, I think it's interesting that citizen assemblies and citizen juries have flourished around these issues, because all of a sudden we're questioning how developments take place in the first place for any of these things, right? So actually it's a push towards much more democratic oversight over all kinds of areas of government, not just to do with technology. And I think what will be key in this is to not treat these technologies as siloed off, as being questions of technology, but actually saying, well, this is an issue of welfare rights or human rights. I mean, so what the UN Special Rapporteur has done, Philip Alston, has now presented his report to the General Assembly on Human Rights about the use on the digital welfare state, on the use of digital technology. So framing this as that kind of issue, and so that it's integrated into how we understand rights more broadly and not as a data protection issue. Yeah.
More comments, questions? Okay, so this was the datafication of the welfare state. Lina, Dencik, thank you very much.
Thank you.